All right, another walk here this morning along the canal here in Old Town Scottsdale. My wife and I moved here a few years ago. I guess it's closer to 3 or 4 years ago. We had downsized and decided to be a little bit more provincial. My wife grew up on Balboa Island in Newport Beach, and so she's used to kind of this lifestyle of everything being just right within, a few hundred feet maybe of where you live. And so that's what we did. We had our last youngest child leave for college 3 or 4 years ago, and we decided we're just going to downsize and live the provincial life in downtown area, and so everything's right around us here. It's kind of nice. A few things I wanted to go over here today. There was from Christopher Rufo, if you know who he is. He's a commentator and activist that has really been working on a number of things. He had put out a few documents on the LA Unified School District that were very interesting. It just came out, it was yesterday. And one of the things that they're focusing on, what it was is just a treasure trove of documents that the school district, this is the second largest school district in the country, and what they're working on is Identitarianism. And so there are several different avenues that these movers and shakers are looking for to get access to the kids in the K-12 space. And that's exactly what they're trying to do. There's no innocence here for most of them that are actually the ones that are pushing these programs. There are programs like SEL, social and emotional learning. There are programs under the name of mental health, and taking the therapy industry, the counseling industry, and using that as a way to get access to the kids and to activate them and to indoctrinate them. It sounds so conspiratorial. I don't know how else to talk about it, but it's real. I mean, I read the documents. When you actually read the documents, then you can see exactly what is going on here. And another one is ethnic studies. So you look at ethnic studies and what's happened there. Gone over that a little bit, but the ethnic studies program is just a way to indoctrinate kids and to radicalize them. And so when you look at the curriculum, it's all about the radicals of the 60s and the 70s, and it's all about it's critical race theory. It's critical race theory primarily is what they focus on with ethnic studies, because it's ethnic. So it's their angle there is race. Of course, it goes beyond that, but that's the focus. And then the other one that you're now starting to see more and more, this is becoming the banner title and concept, is diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And DEI. This is mostly something that was used to get into businesses. And under this banner of DEI, you have all of this other information of sexual liberation, expressive individualism, that a lot of people think that's the main problem. It's not. Expressive individualism is actually kind of a way of, it's actually a way of getting you into a collective. It is not individualistic at all. It is actually becoming part of a collective, of a mindset, of a lockstep movement and ideology. So the idea that, you just be you, is really, let's take you and put you into one of these groups on the intersectional ladder. And then you could just be lockstep with everybody else under this ideology, acting as if you're being some new individual. But really, you're part of an army. You're part of a group. So it's much more about belonging and feeling approved and supported and part of something bigger than it is about individualism. But it's they're doing this under the name of DEI, and under these documents with the Los Angeles Unified School District, you start to see this. Again, second largest school district in the country. And so you start to see this diversity, equity, and inclusion being included at the K-12 space, where usually you've seen it in larger organizations and corporations. And one of the things that they do in these documents is they focus on the breakdown of gender. Yes, so in this Los Angeles school district, one of the focuses is the breakdown of gender. And the way they do this, they recommend in doing this, is that you go in with language. Of course, it's always language. That's how you introduce these things. And you're working with pronouns. And so instead of using normal binary type of pronouns, you're going to be using new pronouns. And the movement on this is to say, okay, we're going to take an upside down approach where you take the margins, the minority, and you move them up to the top. That's what Foucault used to talk about. Michel Foucault of postmodernism is you take the margins and you turn everything upside down and you put it up to the top. And that's why it's important to understand that tolerance, this is not about tolerance. This is about power. This is not about tolerance. This is about surrender. And that's hard to look at because you want tolerance. You want tolerance. You want to support those that are marginalized. That's important. That's really important. That is part of the gospel. And so to mix this together requires a lot of thought and understanding and recognition on language and what's going on out there with this cultural shift. Because if you don't see that, you're going to get caught up on one side or the other. You don't want to be extreme. You don't want to be extreme to the point where you are not being compassionate. But you also don't want to have compassion wipe out and rule over all reason and truth. That's not gospel-centered. So you've got to be able to see what is going on here with these things and understand the nuance. What happens is values. That's how you look at the truth. What do you value most? There are a number of different elements in a truth. Do you take the ones that are lesser and do you move them up above? And compassion, for example. Do you trump truth with this and overthrow truth and reason and gospel principles and commandments for compassion? And is it really compassion? Does it really lead towards something better for someone? And yet, again, other side, loving those around you, especially those that are marginalized and need support and are oftentimes not treated very well in society. Now, the liberation part of this, I wanted to quickly go over because this is, if you go back, and I've done this with a critical social justice presentation, if you go back and you look at liberation and what this means, so we're talking about sexual liberation here. Sexual liberation has always been a major part of a hard left agenda. And so identity to that sexual liberation has become a big part of this. If you go back to Hegel, the philosopher, and you look at that Hegelian dialectic, and you look at the utopia that he's kind of building toward, Aufgehoben is a German word for it. In my mind, what this utopian, this Hegelian utopia, it really is liberation. And ultimately what it means is liberation from all truth. It means liberation from all cultural mores that would hold you back. That would include marriage. That would include traditional gender roles and identities. It's a breakdown of all of those things. To throw all of these things off. And you can look at this even with Freud, right? And the sexual motivation behind his work. And then you go on and you look at Gramsci and Marcuse, and all of these things that have to do with liberation are a throw-off of ultimately truth and traditional family, traditional roles, traditional identities. So the sexual liberation, when you look at this and you see it coming to the kids, you see it being taught in K-12 space, which it is. It's just a continual movement toward that utopia, that Hegelian utopia of liberation and throwing everything off. That's where we get more the idea of the expressive individualism. Now, I wanted to go over the DEI a little bit more. So, in that those documents, this is all about training for the school district. And it's a barrage. It's just nonstop, 24-hour. As Becky Pringle from the NEA says, the National Education Association says, it's all day, every day. And it's propaganda that is non-stop. I don't think we realize how fast this is going to happen. This is not something 10, 20 years off that we're to slowly move toward. This is something that's going to happen very, very quickly. The groundwork is already laid. It's going to happen quickly. But the DEI is difficult because that is now one of the terms, concepts that is becoming more and more solidified in the culture, which is why now you see it going to the K-12 space. And everything that comes behind it, you can see, okay, we're talking about sexual liberation for kids. We're talking about breaking down the binary for kids, which will be taught to them. Don't think about male, female. Don't think about man, woman, boy, girl. That is associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's all the same thing, ultimately. It's all the same thing. But if you look at, for example, the BYU Marriott School of Business, and you look at their diversity and inclusion page, what do you see? You see there it's a page, and at the bottom, you have President Nelson on the diversity and inclusion page. And you have him talking about his talk where or quoting him from his talk where he talks about abandoning attitudes of prejudice. This is going to be really hard. Guys, this is really, really going to be hard. This is the same thing that the professors at BYU use when they talk about things like Ibram Kendi and his anti-racism and his hard leftism. And I'm not saying that's what the Marriott School of Business is doing. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that's why this is going to be really hard. Because you're bringing in language of diversity and inclusion that means so many more things that would be completely against what President Nelson believes and has ever said. But you're putting his face on it, on that term, right? You're putting his face on that term. So what does that mean? I mean, and when you see this over and over again, imagine being at BYU, for example, and you hear this from a professor. Oh, this is the same thing as he and President Nelson and even Kendi are exactly the same. They're saying the same thing, right? They're both Marxists. They're both anti-racist. They're both they both believe in the abolition of the West and of democracy and of the Constitution. everything that goes along with that. Go look at that page on the BYU Marriott School of Business. And you see diversity and inclusion, and then you see the quote at the bottom, and it's all very innocent. It really is. It's innocent. And in a vacuum, it's the right thing. But diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity and inclusion, means something very different from what President Nelson has said. For example, with the LA school district and everywhere else that diversity and inclusion are used. They are used for a hard left revolution. And so how do you parse that out? How do you use President Oak's clear thinking to look at this? And the more you see this, and you're getting it from places like BYU, or you get it from Latter-day Saint influencers, you may start believing it. Oh, it is the same thing. President Nelson does believe in a hard leftist agenda. This stuff might be good. Very, very difficult to go through this. And this is why I know he's talking about identity, right? Identity, this expressive individualism, the identitarianism of intersectionality is key. It is a breakdown of our true identity. So when he goes through the identities, those three, right, of child of God, number one, of child of the covenant, number two, and disciple of Christ, number three, everything else goes below that. And I wish that when these messages were put out by BYU and other places, that they would include that. But imagine how they would get hammered. See, it won't work. It won't work. Imagine if they came in and said, these three identities are more important than your sexual orientation identity, than your race identity. It won't work, and that's how you know. Imagine how the conflict there, and imagine the people that are going to be upset about lowering those identities. You're continually marginalizing people, President Nelson, right? By lowering these identities and lowering the value of these identities and roles as compared to child of God, child of the covenant, and disciple of Christ. So that's the battle, right? That is the battle that we have. How are you going to parse these things out? How are you going to identify these things and understand the difference between these identities and the roles, right? It's about values. It's not that they're not there. It's not that there isn't an identity of sexual orientation. It's not that there's not an identity of ethnicity, of race, of many things, or many things. But it's turning it on its head. It's turning the values on their heads. It's kind of like when Jesus is asked, right, by the lawyer, what is the greatest commandment? And it's interesting because he doesn't answer with one thing, he answers with two. He gives you values. One is a higher value than the other. He gives you context. And he says, right, love the Lord, I'm paraphrasing obviously here, but love the Lord, love God with all your heart, might, and strength. And the second is like unto it, but it's lower. It's the second commandment. And essentially it's love your neighbor as yourself. And so it's the same thing. We can turn that on its head. There was a talk about that recently, and I believe in conference. We could turn that on its head too, and switch the values around. So look for that. Look for the values there. How do you place one above the other? Because that's what truth is. Truth comes in context. And without understanding those values and where they're supposed to lie, then you end up with a lie. And it's the easiest way for the adversary, I think, to lie to us, is to take something that's good and put it above other things that are much more important in our lives. That's how when we misprioritize those values, that's how things fall apart. The whole house of cards falls when we move the values and priorities in our life. Ultimately, these identities come to the family, the traditional family. And that's what is in the crosshairs with identitarianism. That's what's in the crosshairs of expressive individualism. That's what's in the crosshairs of intersectionality. It's your relationship with God first, as a child of God. It's your relationship and your commitments to follow the covenant path and to follow the Savior. And it's your family. Those three things are attacked with identitarianism. Those three things are attacked with DEI, ultimately. Yes, again, values. There are some good things there, talking about specifically in a vacuum, watching out for and supporting the marginalized. We need to do that, and we need to do a better job of it. But we don't need to be absorbed into an ideology that, quite frankly, in the 20th century, similar ideologies killed, 100 million people, and countless number of people suffering and starving and tortured and imprisoned for the idea and the great goal of liberation and equity. Thanks for taking a walk with me.